The Most Holy Mother clothes the infant Jesus in the seamless tunic. She puts shoes on his feet, the doings and observances of the Lord. In order to clothe the divine infant in a small tunic and put on his feet the sandals made by her, the most prudent lady cast herself on her knees before her sweetest Son and addressed him in the following words, quote, Most High Lord and Creator of heaven and earth, I would wish to clothe thee, if possible, in such a way as thy divinity deserves, and I would gladly have made these garments, which are to cover thee from my heart blood. But I know that the poor and insignificant coverings I now offer thee are according to thy desires. Pardon me, my Lord and Master, my faults, and accept the loving affection of her who is but dust and ashes. Allow me to clothe thee. Unquote. The infant Jesus was pleased with the loving service of his purest mother, and thereupon she clothed and shod him, setting him upon his feet. The tunic fitted him perfectly, covering his feet without hindering them in walking, and the sleeves extended to the middle of his hands, although she had taken no measure beforehand. The collar was cut out round without being open in front, and was somewhat raised around the neck, adjusting itself to the throat. Through this opening, the Heavenly Mother passed it over the head of the infant, for the garment gracefully adjusted itself according to her wishes. He never divested himself of this tunic until the executioners themselves tore it off to scourge and afterwards to crucify him. For this garment continually grew with him, adjusting itself to his body. The same happened also with the sandals and with the undergarment, which the solicitous mother made for him. None of all these articles of clothing wore away or became old in the 32 years, nor did the tunic lose its color or its newness, but remained just as it had left the hands of the great lady. Nor did any of them become soiled or filthy, but they preserved their first cleanness. The garment which the Redeemer of the world laid aside in order to wash the feet of his apostles was a mantle or cape, which he wore over his shoulders, and this also had been made by the Virgin after they had returned to Nazareth. Like the other clothing, it grew with the Lord, was of the same color, only a little darker, and was woven in the same way. Thus the infant Lord of the eternities was placed on his feet, after having since his birth been wrapped in swaddling clothes, and held for most of the time in the arms of his most holy mother. John 13:4. He was the most beautiful among the sons of men. The angels were astonished at the humble and poor raiment chosen by him, who clothes the heavens in light and the fields with beauty. He walked freely on his feet in the presence of his parents, but before strangers this wonder remained for a time concealed, since the queen took him in her arms when outsiders approached or whenever they went abroad. Indescribable was the joy of the Heavenly Lady and of Saint Joseph as they saw the infant walking about and exhibit such rare beauty. He received nourishment at the breast of his purest mother until he was a year and a half old, and no longer. His meals thereupon were most frugal, as well in quantity as quality. At first they consisted in broths mixed with oil and some fruits or fishes. While he was still in the process of growth, she gave him to eat 3 times a day, as often as she had formerly given him her milk, in the morning, afternoon, and at night. The divine child never asked for food, but the loving mother, with thoughtful anxiety, provided him his meals at the proper time until later on, when he was already grown up and would not consent to eat oftener or at other hours than the heavenly spouses themselves. This was his rule until he reached adult age, of which I will speak later on. Whenever he took his meals with his parents, they always waited until he should pronounce the blessing at the beginning and give thanks at the end. From the time the child Jesus was on his feet, he commenced to retire and spent certain hours of the day in the oratory of his mother. As the most prudent mother was anxious to know his wishes in regard to her intercourse with him, the Lord responded to her mute appeal, saying, quote, My mother, enter and remain with me always, in order that thou mayest imitate me in my works, for I wish that in thee be modeled and exhibited the high perfection which I desire to see accomplished in the souls. For if they had not resisted my first intentions, 1 Timothy 2:4, they would have been endowed with my most abundant and copious gifts. But since the human race has hindered this, I have chosen thee as the vessel of all perfection and of the treasures of my right hand, which the rest of the creatures have abused and lost. Observe me, therefore, in all my actions for the purpose of imitating me. Unquote. Thus the Heavenly Lady was installed anew as the disciple of her most holy Son. Thenceforward pass such great and hidden mysteries between these two that not until the day of eternity will they be known. Many times the divine child prostrated himself on the ground. At others he was raised from the ground in the form of a cross, earnestly praying to the Eternal Father for the salvation of mortals. In all this his most loving mother imitated him, for to her were manifest the interior operations of his most holy soul, just as well as the exterior movements of his body. Of this knowledge of most pure Mary I have spoken in other parts of this history, and it is necessary to point it out often, because this was the source of the light which guided her in her holy life. It was such a singular blessing that all creatures together will not be able to understand or describe it by their united powers. The great lady did not always enjoy visions of the divinity, but always the sight of her most holy humanity and soul of her Son, with all their activities. In a special manner, she was witness of the effects of the hypostatic and beatific vision, or union, of the humanity with the divinity. Although she did not always see this glory and this union substantially, yet she perceived the interior acts by which his humanity reverenced, loved, and magnified the divinity to which it was united, and this privilege was reserved solely to Most Holy Mary. On these occasions it often happened that the child Jesus, in the presence of his Most Holy Mother, wept and perspired blood, for this happened many times before his agony in the garden. Then the Blessed Lady would wipe his face, interiorly perceiving and knowing the cause of this agony, namely the loss of the foreknown, and of those who would be ungrateful for the benefits of their Creator and Redeemer, and in whom the works of the infinite power and goodness of the Lord would be wasted. At other times the Blessed Mother would find him refulgent with heavenly light and surrounded by angels that sang sweet hymns of praise, and she was made aware that the Heavenly Father was pleased in his beloved and only begotten Son. Matthew 17:5. All these wonders commenced from the time when at the age of 1 year he began to walk, witnessed only by his Holy Mother, whose heart was to be the treasure house of his wonders. The works of love, praise, and worshipful gratitude, his petitions for the human race, all exceed my ability to describe. I must refer the understanding of it to the faith and piety of the Christians. The child Jesus grew in the admiration and esteem of all that came to know him. Having reached the age of 6 years, he began now and then to visit the sick in the hospitals, seeking out the stricken ones, and mysteriously comforting and consoling them in their afflictions. Many of the inhabitants of Heliopolis began to know him. The secret attractions of his divinity and sanctity drew toward him the hearts of all, and many offered him gifts. These, according to the promptings of his interior knowledge, he refused or accepted for distribution among the poor. The admiration caused by his wise counsels and his modest and considerate behavior caused many to extol and congratulate the parents on such a son. Although all of them were ignorant of the mysteries and of the dignity of the Son and the Mother, yet the Lord of creation, being desirous of honoring his mother, permitted them to reverence her as far as was possible under the circumstances, without learning the special reason for doing so. Many of the children of Heliopolis gathered around the child Jesus, as it is natural with children of similar age and condition. Since they were free from great malice and were not given to inquire whether he was more than man, but freely admitted the heavenly light, the Master of Truth welcomed them as far as was befitting. He instilled into them the knowledge of God and of the virtues. He taught and catechized them in the way of eternal life, even more abundantly than the adults. As his words were full of life and strength, he won their hearts and impressed his truths so deeply upon them that all those who had this good fortune afterwards became great and saintly men, for in the course of time they ripened in themselves the fruit of this heavenly seed sown so early in their souls. The Blessed Mother was well informed of all these happenings. Whenever her most holy Son returned from these errands in which he had fulfilled the will of his eternal Father by looking after his flock, the Queen and the angels prostrated themselves before her divine Son and gave him thanks for the benefits done to those innocents who did not yet know him for their true God. And she kissed his feet. And she kissed his feet as those of the high priest of heaven and earth. Hebrews 4:1. This she also did whenever the child was about to go forth. On such occasions he would raise her up from the earth in filial reverence and love. The mother also asked for his blessing upon all her undertakings, and she never lost any occasion for practicing virtue with all the intensity of her love and divine grace. Never was any grace given in her without its fruit. Never was any grace in her without its fruit, but it operated in all its plenitude and increased in operation. The great lady sought new means and ways of humiliating herself, adoring the incarnate Word by her genuflections and prostrations, and other most loving and profound ceremonies as outward tokens of her prudence and holiness. This she attended to with such wisdom that she excited the admiration of the angels themselves, who, interchanging among themselves the praises of the divinity, said to each other, quote, "Who is that pure creature, so full of delight to our Creator and her Son?" Canticles 1:2. Who is this one that so wisely and attentively honors and reverences the Most High, far exceeding us in all her loving alertness and attention? Unquote. In his intercourse and conversation with his parents, this most wonderful and beautiful child, after he had begun to walk and grow larger, showed more gravity than when he was younger. The tender caresses, which always had been tempered and measured, were now withheld, for in his countenance shone forth such majesty as a reflection of his hidden deity, that if he had not mixed it with a certain sweetness and affability, reverential fear would have prevented all intercourse with him. The Heavenly Mother and Saint Joseph felt the effects of a divine power and efficacy, as well as the kindness and devotedness of a loving Father, proceeding from his countenance. Joined with this majesty and magnificence was his filial affection toward his Heavenly Mother, while on the other hand he treated Saint Joseph as one who had as well the name as the duties of a father toward him, and therefore he obeyed them both as a most devoted son obeys his parents. In his whole behavior, the incarnate Word practiced the virtues of obedience, humility, and human kindness, with such an admirable mixture of majesty and gravity, that his divine wisdom shone forth in all his actions, and that none of his grandeur was impaired by triviality or smallness. The heavenly Queen was most attentive to all these mysteries, and she alone, as far as a mere creature could, comprehended befittingly the work of her most holy Son, and understood the ways of his infinite wisdom. I would attempt the impossible to try to describe in human words the effects of all his doings on her most pure and prudent soul, or how closely she imitated his ineffable sanctity. The souls which were converted and saved in Heliopolis and in all Egypt, the sick that were cured, and the wonders wrought during their 7 years' stay in that country cannot be enumerated. Such a blessed crime did the cruelty of Herod turn out to be for Egypt. The goodness and wisdom of God draws from the very wickedness and evils of sin the greatest good. If in one direction men cast away his mercies and shut them out, he calls upon them in other directions to open their hearts and admit his blessings. Job 34:24. His ardent desires to benefit the human race cannot be quenched by the floods of our sins and ingratitudes. Instruction given to me by the Queen of Heaven, Most Holy Mary. My daughter, excuse me. My daughter, from the very beginning of this history of my life, thou wast made to understand that among other purposes, the Lord wished to call the attention of mortals to the debt contracted by their unfeeling forgetfulness of his divine love and of mine toward them. It is true that all his love is included and made manifest in his having died on the cross for them. For this was the extremity of his immense charity. John 3:16. But many ungrateful men are loath to remember even this blessing. For such and for all others, the knowledge of what he did for them during the 33 years should be a new incentive and spur of love, since each of his acts was worth an infinite price and merited our eternal gratitude. The Almighty set me as a witness to all of them, and I assure thee that from the first instant of his conception in my womb he ceased not to clamor to the Father for the salvation of men. From that moment he began to embrace the cross. Hebrews 10:5. Not only in desire, but also as far as was possible in effect, placing himself in the position of one crucified from his infancy and continuing these exercises during his whole life. I also imitated him in this, joining him in his prayers and labors for mankind, and in the very first acts of his most sacred humanity, by which he rendered thanks for the salvation of men. Let therefore mortals beware, lest I, who was a witness and cooperatrix of this salvation, be not also a witness and cooperatrix in the day of judgment, proclaiming how well justified is the cause of God with men. If on that day I most justly refuse my intercession to those who have foolishly despised and forgotten so many and so great favors and blessings, the results of the divine love of my Son and my own, what answer, what excuse or evasion shall those then bring forward who have been so well informed, so much admonished and enlightened by truth? How can these ungrateful and pertinacious mortals expect mercy of the most just and righteous God, when he has given them sufficient and opportune time, invited them so often, called them, waited and worked for them, and conferred upon them immense blessings, while they abused and wasted all of them in the pursuit of vanity? Fear, my daughter, this, the greatest of all blindness. Refresh ever the memory of the most holy works of my Son and of me, and imitate them with all thy fervor. Continue the exercises of the cross under the guidance of obedience, in order to keep thyself mindful of what thou must imitate and give thanks for. Take notice at the same time that my Son and Lord could have redeemed the human race without suffering so much, and that he wished to increase his sufferings only on account of the immensity of his love for souls. The return for such condescension should be that the creature content not itself with little, as is ordinarily the case with ignorant men. And thou virtue to virtue, add thou virtue to virtue, and seek thereby evermore to meet all thy obligations, imitating the Lord in me in our labors for the salvation of the world. All thy merits offer up for souls, uniting them with his merits in the presence of the eternal Father. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph returned to Nazareth at the command of the Lord. The child Jesus reached the end of his 7th year while in Egypt, which was also the term set by the eternal wisdom for his mysterious sojourn in that land. I apologize. In order that the prophecies might be fulfilled, it was necessary that he return to Nazareth. This decree the Eternal Father intimated to his most holy Son on a certain day in the presence of his Holy Mother, and while she was with him in prayer. She saw it mirrored in his deified soul, and she saw how he submitted to it in obedience to the Father. Therein the great lady joined him, although they had already become better acquainted and habituated to the present abode than to their own native city of Nazareth. Neither the mother nor the son made known to Saint Joseph this new decree of heaven, but in that very night the angel of the Lord spoke to him in his sleep, as Matthew relates, Matthew 2:19, and bade him take the child and its mother and return to the land of Israel, for Herod and those who with him had sought the life of the child were dead. So much value does the Almighty set on the proper order in created things, that though Jesus was the true God, and his mother so highly exalted above Saint Joseph in sanctity, he did not permit the arrangements of this journey to proceed from his son, nor from his mother, but from Saint Joseph, who was the head of this family. God intended to teach all mortals that he wishes all things to be governed by the natural order set up by his providence, and that the inferiors and subjects of the mystical body of the Church, even though they may excel in virtue and in certain other respects, must obey and submit to their superiors and prelates in the visible order. Saint Joseph immediately notified the child Jesus and his mother of the command of the Lord, and both of them answered that the will of the Heavenly Father must be done. Thereupon they resolved upon their journey without delay, immediately distributing among the poor the little furniture contained in their dwelling. This was done by the hands of the divine child, for the heavenly mother often consigned into his hands what she had destined as alms to the poor, knowing that the child, as the God of mercy, loved to exercise it with his own hands. Matthew 25:40. When she gave him these alms, the Most Holy Mother, falling on her knees, said, quote, "Take, my Son and Lord, whatever thou desirest, in order to share it with the poor, our friends and brothers." Unquote. The blessed dwelling, which had been sanctified and consecrated for 7 years by the presence of the high priest Jesus, was left in the possession of certain of the most devout and pious persons in Heliopolis. Their virtue and holiness had gained them a favor which they could not now fully estimate, although, on account of what they had seen and experienced, they counted themselves indeed fortunate to occupy the same house in which these strangers had lived for 7 years. This affectionate devotion was rewarded by abundant light and grace for their eternal salvation. They departed for Palestine in the company of angels, as on the way thence. The great queen sat on the ass with the divine child on her lap, and Saint Joseph walked afoot, closely following the Son and Mother. On account of the loss of such great benefactors, their acquaintances and friends were very sorrowful at the news of their departure. With incredible weeping and sighing they saw them leave, knowing and loudly complaining that they were now losing all their consolation and refuge in their necessities. If the divine power had not interfered, the Holy Family would have found great difficulty in leaving Heliopolis, for its inhabitants began to feel the night of their miseries secretly setting upon their hearts at the parting of the sun, which had dispersed and brightened its darkness. John 1:9. In traversing the inhabited country, they passed through some towns of Egypt, where they scattered their graces and blessings. The news of their passage spreading about, all the sick, the afflicted, and disconsolate gathered to seek them out, and they found themselves relieved in body and soul. Many of the sick were cured. Many demons were expelled without their knowledge who it was that had thus hurled them back to hell. Yet they felt the divine power which compelled them and wrought such blessings among men. I will not tarry to relate the particular events of this journey of the child Jesus and his most blessed mother out of Egypt, for it is not necessary, nor could it be done without extending this history too much. It will suffice to say that all who came to them with greater or lesser devotion left their presence enlightened with truth, assisted by grace, and wounded with the love of God. They felt a secret force which urged and compelled them to the pursuit of virtue, and while withdrawing them from the paths of death, showed them the way of eternal life. They came to the Son, drawn to him by the Father, and they turned to the Father, sent there by the divine light of Christ's truth, which enkindled their souls with the knowledge of the true God. John 6:44. Nevertheless, he concealed himself, since it was not yet time to reveal himself openly. But the fire which he had come to enkindle and spread in this world, secretly and incessantly produced its divine effects among men. Having thus fulfilled the mysteries decreed by the divine will and issuing from the inhabited regions of this country, which they had signalized by their miracles, our heavenly pilgrims entered the desert through which they had come. In it they again suffered labors and difficulties similar to those of their flight from Palestine, for the Lord continued to permit hardships and tribulation in order to afford them occasion of merit and provide a proper relief. He administered to these necessities by the hands of the angels as in the first journey, or sometimes the child Jesus himself commanded them to provide sustenance. Very often Saint Joseph, in order that he might become more sensible of the divine favor, was permitted to hear these commands, and saw how these spirits obeyed and readily procured what was wanted. This greatly encouraged and consoled the holy patriarch in his sorrow and anxiety for the King and Queen of Heaven. At other times the divine child made use of his omnipotence, and created all that was necessary to supply their wants out of a crumb of bread. The rest of the journey was similar to the journey described before in chapter 22. Therefore I do not think it necessary to repeat the description. When, however, they arrived at the confines of Palestine, the anxious husband was informed that Archelaus had succeeded Herod, his father, in the government of Judea, Matthew 2:22, fearing that, with the sovereignty he had inherited, also his cruelty, Saint Joseph turned from his route without going to Jerusalem or entering Judea, and passing through the land of the tribe of Dan and Issachar, below Galilee, following the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and passing Jerusalem to his right. They reached Nazareth, their home, for the child was to be called a Nazarene. They found their former humble house in charge of the devout cousin of St. Joseph, who, as I have mentioned in the 12th chapter of the 3rd book, had offered to serve him while our queen was absent in the house of Elizabeth. Before they had left Judea for Egypt, St. Joseph had written to this woman, asking her to take care of the house and what it contained. They found it all in good condition, and his cousin received them with great joy on account of her love for the great queen, though at the same time she did not know of her dignity. The heavenly lady entered with her son and St. Joseph, and immediately she prostrated herself in adoration of the Lord and in thanksgiving for having led them safe from the cruelty of Herod to this retreat and preserved them in the dangers of their banishment and their long and arduous journeys. Above all, did she render thanks for having returned in company with her son, now grown both in years and in grace and virtue. Luke 2:40. Taking counsel with her divine child, she proceeded to set up a rule of life and regulate her pious practices. Not that she had failed to observe a rule of life on her journey, for the most prudent lady, in imitation of her son, had always observed the most perfect order according to circumstances. But being now peacefully settled in her home, she wished to include many exercises which on the journey were impossible. Her greatest solicitude was always to cooperate with her most holy Son for the salvation of souls, which was the work most urgently enjoined upon her by the Eternal Father. Toward this most high end our Queen directed all her practices in union with the Redeemer, and this was their constant occupation, as we shall see in the course of this second part. The holy Joseph also ordered his occupations and his work so as most worthily to earn sustenance for the divine child and his mother as well as for himself. That which in other sons of Adam is considered a punishment and a hardship was to this holy patriarch a great happiness. For while others were condemned to sustain their natural life by the ardor of their hands and the sweat of their brows, St. Joseph was blessed and consoled beyond measure to know that he had been chosen by his labor and his sweat to support God himself and his mother, to whom belonged heaven and earth and all they contain. Esther 13:10. The Queen of the Angels herself undertook to pay the debt of gratitude due to St. Joseph for his labors and solicitude. Accordingly, she provided his meals and attended to his comforts with incredible care and most loving gratitude. She was obedient to him in all things, and humbled herself before him as if she were his handmaid, and not his spouse, or, what is more, not the mother of the Creator and Lord of all. She counted herself unworthy of existence and of being suffered to walk upon the earth, for she thought it just that she should be in want of all things. In the consciousness of having been created out of nothing, and therefore unable to make any return for either its benefit or, according to her estimation, for any of the others, she established in herself such a rare humility that she thought herself less than the dust and unworthy to mingle with it. For the least favors she gave admirable thanks to the Lord as to the first cause and origin of them all, and to creatures as to the instruments of his bounty. To some she gave thanks because they conferred favors upon her, to others because they had denied them, and to others again because they bore with her in patience. She acknowledged herself as indebted to all of them, though she filled them with the blessings of sweetness, and placed herself at the feet of all, seeking ingenious means and artifices to let no instant and no occasion pass for practicing the most perfect and exalted virtues to the admiration of the angels and the pleasure and delight of the Most High. Instruction which the Queen of Heaven gave me. My daughter, while journeying at the command of the Lord from one country to another, and during the works enjoined upon me, my heart was never troubled, nor my spirit cast down, for I always held myself prepared to fulfill entirely the will of God. Although the Lord made known to me his high ends, yet this was not always done at the beginning, thus permitting me to endure so much the greater sufferings. For in obeying the Lord no further reason is necessary than that the Lord Creator so commands and disposes. The souls must accustom themselves to look for this motive alone, and to learn solely to please the Lord, without distinguishing between fortunate or unfortunate events, and without looking to their own inclinations. In this kind of wisdom, I wish that thou advance, in imitation of me, and to satisfy thy obligations toward my most holy Son, do thou receive prosperity or adversity in this mortal life with unmoved countenance, and with equanimity and peace of mind. Let not the one grieve, nor the other vainly rejoice thee, but attend only to all that which the Almighty ordains to his pleasure. Human life is interwoven thus variously with both kinds of events, some of them according, others contrary to the likings of mortals, some which they abhor, others which they desire. As the human heart is limited and narrow, it immoderately inclines to extremes, boundlessly desiring what it loves and likes, and on the other hand, grieving and sorrowing at what it abhors and dislikes. These changeful moods and fluctuations create danger for all or many virtues. The disorderly love for one creature which it cannot attain moves the soul presently to desire another, expecting a balm for its disappointment in the former. And if it is successful, the soul becomes involved and flurried in the desire of retaining what it possesses, thus casting itself by these velleities into still greater disorders and passions. Attend, therefore, dearest, to this danger, and attack it at the root by preserving thy heart independent and riveted only on the divine providence, without ever allowing it to incline toward what it desires or longs for, or to abhor what is painful to it. Let the will of the Lord be thy only delight and joy. Let neither thy desires draw thee on, nor thy fears dishearten thee. Let not thy exterior occupations, and much less thy regard or attention to creatures, ever impede thee or divert thee from thy holy exercises, attending always to my example. Seek thou lovingly and diligently to follow in my footsteps. And that ends this volume. This is the third volume. Probably get one more chapter in. Okay. Okay, the Lord still further tries the Most Holy Mary by acting toward her with a certain distance and severity. The reasons for this behavior are explained. Already Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had settled in Nazareth, and thus changed their poor and humble dwelling into heaven. First it says, concerning this, the perfection with which the Most Holy Mary copied and imitated the activity of the soul of Christ, how the incarnate Word instructed her in the laws of grace, the articles of faith, the sacraments, the 10 Commandments, and with what alacrity and noble promptitude she corresponded. Also concerning the death of St. Joseph, the preaching of St. John, the fasting and the baptism of our Redeemer, the call of the first disciples, and the baptism of the Virgin Mary, our Blessed Lady. That's all in this volume. In order to describe the mysteries and sacraments which had passed between the Divine Child and his purest Mother before his 12th year and later on, until his public preaching, many chapters and many books would be required, and in them all I would be able to relate but the smallest part in view of the vastness of the subject and the insignificance of such an ignorant woman as I am. Even with the light given me by this great lady, I can speak of only a few incidents, and must leave the greater part unsaid. It is not possible or befitting to us mortals to comprehend all these mysteries in this life, since they are reserved for the future life. Shortly after their return from Egypt to Nazareth, the Lord resolved to try his most holy Mother in the same manner as he had tried her in her childhood, and as was mentioned in the second book of the first part, chapter 27. Although she was now vastly grown in the exercise of her love and wisdom, yet as the power of God and the object of divine charity is infinite, and as moreover the capacity of the Queen exceeded that of all creatures, the Lord wished to raise her to a higher level of holiness and merit. Moreover, being a true educator of the Spirit, he wished to form of her a disciple of such exalted knowledge that she would truly be for us a consummate teacher and a living example of his own doctrines. For such was to be her office after the ascension of her Son and Redeemer, as I will relate in the third part. It was also befitting and necessary for the honor of Christ, our Redeemer, that the teaching of the gospel by which and on which he was to found the law of grace, holy, immaculate, and without a wrinkle, should give full evidence of its efficacy and power in a mere creature, and that all its adequate and supereminent effects should be exhibited in someone who could be a standard for all men. It is clear that this creature could be none else than the most blessed Mary, who, as his mother, stood so close to the Master and Teacher of all holiness. The Most High therefore resolved that the Heavenly Lady should be the first disciple of his school, and the firstborn daughter of the new law of grace, the most perfect copy of his ideals, and the most pliant material upon which, as a liquid wax, should be set the seal of his doctrine of holiness, so that the Son and the Mother might be the two true tablets of the law of the world. Exodus 31:18. For this purpose of the infinite wisdom, he manifested to her all the mysteries of the evangelical law and of his doctrine, and this was the subject of his instructions from the time of their return from Egypt until his public preaching, as we shall see in the course of this history. In these hidden sacraments, the incarnate Word and his Holy Mother occupied themselves during the 23 years of their stay in Nazareth. As all this concerned the Heavenly Mother alone, whose life the Holy Evangelists did not profess to narrate, the writers of the Gospel made no mention of it, excepting that which was related of the child Jesus, when in his 12th year he was lost in Jerusalem. During all those years, Mary alone was the disciple of Christ. In addition, therefore, to the ineffable gifts of grace and holiness which he had conferred upon her until their arrival in Nazareth, he infused into her new light and made her a participant in his divine knowledge, depositing and engraving into her heart the whole law and doctrine of grace, which to the end of the world was to be dispensed by his holy church. This was moreover effected in such an exalted manner that no human thought or words can express it, and the great lady was thereby filled with such wisdom and knowledge that it would suffice to enlighten many worlds if there were more than one. In order to rear in the heart of the purest Virgin this edifice of holiness to a height beyond all that is not God, the Lord laid its foundations accordingly, trying the strength of her love and of all her other virtues. For this purpose the Lord withdrew himself, causing her to lose him from her sight, which until then had caused her to revel in continual joy and delight. I do not wish to say that the Lord left her bodily, but still remaining with her and in her by an ineffable presence and grace, he hid himself from her interior sight and suspended the tokens of his most sweet affection. The Heavenly Lady, in the meanwhile, knew not the inward cause of this behavior, as the Lord gave her no explanation. Moreover, her divine Son, without any forewarning, showed himself very reserved and withdrew from her society. Many times he retired and spoke but few words to her, and even these with great earnestness and majesty. But what was apt to afflict her most was the eclipse of the light by which she was wont to see reflected as in a crystal the human operations of his most pure soul. This light was suddenly dimmed so much that she could not thenceforth distinguish them as a living copy for her own actions. This unannounced and unexpected change was the crucible in which the purest gold of the love of our Queen was cleansed and assayed. Surprised at what was happening, she immediately took refuge in the humble opinion she had of herself, deeming herself unworthy of the vision of the Lord, who now had hidden himself. She attributed it all to her want of correspondence and to her ingratitude for the blessings she had obtained from the most generous and exalted Father of mercies. The most prudent Queen did not feel so much the privation of his delightful caresses as the dread of having displeased him and of having fallen short in his service. This was the arrow that pierced her heart with grief. One filled with such true and noble love could not feel less, for all delight of love is founded in the pleasure and satisfaction given by the lover to the one beloved, and therefore he cannot rest when he suspects that the beloved is not contented or pleased. The loving sighs of his mother were highly pleasing to her most holy Son. He was enamored with her anew, and the tender affection of his only and chosen one wounded his heart. Canticles 4:9. But whenever the sweet mother sought him out in order to hold converse with him, he continued to show exterior reserve. Just as the flame of a forge or a conflagration is intensified by the application of insufficient water, so the flame of love in the heart of the sweetest mother was fanned to an intenser blaze by this adversity. The single-hearted dove exercised herself in heroic acts of all the virtues. She humbled herself below the dust. She reverenced her Son in deepest adoration. She blessed the Father, thanking him for his admirable works and blessings, and conforming herself to his wishes and pleasure. She sought to know his will in order to fulfill it in all things. She unceasingly renewed her acts of faith, hope, and burning love, and in all her actions and in all circumstances, this most fragrant spikenard gave forth the odor of sweetness for him, the King of Kings, who rested in her heart as in his flowery and perfumed couch. Canticles 1:11. She persevered in her tearful prayers with continual sighing and longing for her inmost heart, from her inmost heart. She poured forth her prayers in the presence of the Lord and recounted her tribulation before the throne of God. Psalms 141:3. And many times she broke out in words of ineffable sweetness and loving sorrow, such as these, quote, "Creator of all the universe," she would say, "eternal and almighty God, infinite is thy wisdom and goodness, incomprehensible in essence and perfection. Well do I know that my sighs are not hidden to thee, and that thou knowest of the wound that pierces my heart. If as a useless handmaid I have fallen short in thy service, and in pleasing thee, why, O life of my soul, dost thou not afflict me and chastise me with all the pains and sufferings of this my mortal life, so that I may not be obliged to endure the turning away of thy eyes, though I have deserved this treatment through my default? All punishments would be less than this, for my heart cannot bear thy displeasure. Thou alone, O Lord, art my life, my happiness, my glory, and my treasure. My soul counts for nothing at all. For nothing, all that thou hast created and their image lives not in my soul, except in order to magnify thy greatness, and to acknowledge thee as Creator and Lord of all. What shall I then do, if thou, my blessed Lord, the light of my eyes, the goal of my desires, the north star of my pilgrimage, the life of my being, and the essence of my life, fail me? Who will give fountains to my eyes to bewail my want of correspondence to all the blessings I have received, and my ingratitude for my benefits? My Lord, my light, my guide and teacher on the way, who by thy most exalted and perfect operations directest my fragile and lukewarm undertakings, how can I regulate my life if thou fail me as my model? Who will guide me securely through this desert? What shall I do? Whither shall I turn if thou deprivest me of thy assistance?" Unquote. Nor did this wounded deer rest satisfied therewith, but thirsting after the purest fountains of grace, she addressed herself also to the holy angels and held long conferences and colloquies with them, saying, quote, "Sovereign princes and intimate friends of the highest King, my guardians, by your felicitous vision of his divine countenance," Matthew 18:10, "and the ineffable light," 1 Timothy 6:16, "I conjure you to tell me the cause of his displeasure, if such he has conceived against me. Intercede for me in his real presence, that through your prayers he may pardon me if I have offended him. Remind him, my friends, that I am but dust," Job 10:9, "although I am formed by his hands and have upon me the seal of his image. Beseech him not to forget his needy one to the end, so that she may confess and magnify his name." Psalms 73:19. "Ask him to give back to me the breath of life, which fails me at the dread of having lost his love. Tell me how and by what means I can please him and regain the joy of his countenance." Unquote. The holy angels answered, quote, "Our Queen and Sovereign, dilated is thy heart, so that thou canst not be vanquished by tribulation, and none is so able as thou to understand how near the Lord is to the afflicted who call upon him." Psalms 40:15. "Without doubt he recognizes thy affection and does not despise thy loving sighs." Psalms 37:10. "Even shalt thou find him a kind father, and his only begotten a most affectionate son, looking upon thy affliction." Unquote. The lovelorn mother replied, quote, "Will it perhaps be presumption to appear before him and prostrate myself before him, asking his pardon for any fault he might find in me? What shall I do? What relief can I find in my anxieties?" Unquote. And the holy princes answered, quote, "An humble heart does not displease our King." 50. 9. Oh, it didn't give a book with that one. Upon it he fixes his loving regard, and he is never displeased by the clamors of those who act in love, unquote. And I'm going to leave it there for tonight. We'll take up this chapter tomorrow. All praise, honor, and glory be to God in the highest. Blessed be the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. May God bless and keep you.